Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here and to be rounding out the panel today. While I am a professor at the uni now, I really have my feet on the ground as a teacher of the deaf, as you noted, for about 20 years. And that has given me a real perspective on the education of deaf students from before the days of cochlear implants, and you can see that hearing aid in the picture there, to the days now where most of our children have bilateral early implants. Next slide, please. And from that perspective, I have a very short answer to the question, how are students with cochlear implants doing? Better than we could ever have imagined. Speaking for colleagues like Sue Archibald and Greg Lee and myself, we would suggest that cochlear implantation has impacted outcomes for those profoundly deaf children in ways that nothing else before has done. AVT approaches, sign bilingualism, nothing has impacted outcomes for deaf children the way that cochlear implants have. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of that perspective, if you're not as old as I am and you didn't have that opportunity to experience educational life before cochlear implants, before implants, it was the case that profoundly deaf children had very limited auditory access to spoken language. They had poor outcomes in language and literacy really around the globe. No place was different. And you will often see cited that they graduated from high school reading and writing at the level of a 9-year-old hearing student. And those references go back 100 years to Pintner and Patterson in 1916. Most students in those days were educated in congregated settings, a class or a school for the deaf, and often used sign communication to support access. Next slide, please. But after cochlear implants, meaningful auditory access to spoken language happened, and think about this, for the very first time in the history of deaf education, those profoundly deaf children could hear. And that meant that we were starting to see age-appropriate outcomes for these children, not just in a language, sometimes in more than one language. So for example, in Canada, an officially bilingual country in French and English, in the early days when I was teaching, those deaf children weren't allowed, they didn't have the opportunity to study in French. It was seen that English was enough of a challenge. Now it's regularly the case that profoundly deaf students are taking 2 languages in school. Most of these children are now educated in inclusive, integrated, mainstream settings, and there is far less use of signed communication. Next slide, please. But, and here's the but, there's always a but. These outcomes are amazing, but will these children with cochlear implants now be victims of their own success? Are they doing so well? Is the perception now that they're doing so well, they don't need anything anymore? They can hear, all is well. We know that's not the case. That's been pointed out in many of the presentations today for adults. It's the same story for students. So the question then becomes, what does support look like for students with cochlear implants? Who provides the support? How much support should they get? What kind of support? And how does this support carry on beyond the preschool years? And then what about the students with cochlear implants who struggle? While many do marvelously well, not all do. What about the students who were later implanted, who did get solid early support services, or who have additional needs? Those are all the questions we have to answer going forward. And across the board, access is still an issue. As Omar, a cochlear implant user who's 16, whose home language is Pashto, he writes, "The reason why I don't like the new average class size changes is because I am deaf, hard of hearing student. And so this increase of class sizes will make it really hard for me to learn anything, especially when it gets too noisy." Next slide, please. So if access was always an issue and we already had challenges, then along came a pandemic. And as already been pointed out before, masks don't make life easier for our students. The auditory input is degraded, especially for high frequency sounds. We know that the surgical or KN95 masks are better, but here's an interesting fact. Clear masks are worse, at least for hearing. So now do you have to choose between hearing well and seeing to speech read? If you want to check out a really interesting link, you could take a look at a YouTube clip called "Which Mask is Best for Hearing?" from the University of Illinois Augmented Listening Laboratory. You could probably Google that, it will come up, which gives a really nice discussion of masks. And pandemic classrooms are noisier than pre-pandemic classrooms. Now that we want to make the air cleaner, we have air ventilation systems, and they're noisy, and it makes it harder to hear. And interestingly, cheaper units are louder. So you can imagine what are school systems going to buy, the cheaper units, because they clear the air just as well, but they're louder, which means the listening environment is even worse than it was before. The good news is sound field systems can help, so we need to advocate for them. And a handy tip from the University of Illinois lab is that if you put the microphone below your chin when wearing a mask, you get better access. And I love this phrase. It's not mine. I borrowed it from Karen Gordon and her colleagues at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, who recently completed a study of access to spoken communication for children and students with cochlear implants during the pandemic. They used the phrase quieting of children's lives. That research is showing an association between lockdowns and a reduction in access to spoken communication. In their research, they found that school-aged children with cochlear implants from kindergarten through high school are experiencing a significant decrease in exposure to speech sounds, and a decrease that equals about an hour a day. What that means in real terms is these students are missing between 600 and 2,000 words a day, or about 100 to 400 conversational turns. Now think about what this means for language learning and development, especially for younger children, where an hour missed is an hour of language development missed, which is critical in those early years. Next slide, please. And I can't leave the impact of pandemics without saying a little bit about learning online. While it's great, we've all been on Zoom a lot, and there's a lot of positive elements to being able to teach online. Most teachers and students don't love it. So I pulled together a few quotes from some stakeholders. One teacher who said, "I just want to put my arm through the screen to sort out that technology or turn the pages in a book or point at something. It's just tough to teach online." And as one administrator said, in terms of providing access online, captions are great, but not for younger students who don't know how to read. And the view from a student with a cochlear implant, he said, "I just get tired. It's hard work to watch and listen, and it gets boring too." So teaching and schooling online is not always as great as we might like it to be. Next slide, please. But wanting to leave on a positive note, I wanted to give you a little story of Holly, and I thank a colleague of mine who is Holly's teacher. Holly was able to get her implant during COVID as someone who had a progressive loss and had been using hearing aids. So she was lucky that she didn't fall through the cracks with all of our delayed services and waiting lists. And Holly writes, "I think having CIs at this time in my life has been a benefit. If I were to have hearing aids like I did at the start of COVID, it would be a struggle all the way through. When I was online before with my hearing aids, I would do everything to try and hear people on meetings, turn up the volume, go to a quiet room. Once I got my CIs and we did online, I didn't even have to try. I could just hear so well." So implants are truly making a difference for students like Holly. Next, final slide, please. So my takeaway thoughts here, I can't leave this meeting without celebrating and underscoring, and I put it in red, the remarkable achievements of students with cochlear implants. For those of us who've had the perspective of before and after implants, this is a milestone in the history of deaf education. But we best be very careful not to take this success for granted. There's no guarantees. These students are going to continue to need our support. We're going to have to think about and advocate for what that support looks like, even after the pandemic is over. Thanks so much, and I'm happy to take questions, and I'm happy to take email questions as well, and we'll post my email address. Thank you.